The smoke from Grandmother Nellie's sweetgrass braid curled upward through the afternoon light, carrying prayers that had been spoken in the same way for generations. It was 1974, and in the small living room of her home on the Standing Rock Reservation, she sat, surrounded by her grandchildren, teaching them words in Lakota that fewer and fewer young people seemed to remember. The television in the corner sat silent, a deliberate choice. "The stories live in our voices," she would say, "not in that box." Across Indian country during those years, something precious was slipping away like water through cupped hands. The traditions that had survived centuries of upheaval were facing a new kind of threat, not the outright suppression of earlier eras, but something quieter, more insidious. The pull of mainstream American culture, the scattering of families, the slow erosion of daily practices that had once been as natural as breathing. What was happening wasn't dramatic enough to make the evening news, but it was profound enough to change everything. The naming ceremonies had been one of the first things to fade in many communities. Thomas Whitebird, a Northern Cheyenne elder, remembered how it used to be. "When I was a boy in the 30s and 40s, he told a gathering in 1978, every child received their name in ceremony. Your name wasn't just what people called you, it was your spirit, your purpose, your connection to everything that came before." By the 70s, many Native children were simply given English names at birth, never experiencing the profound moment when an elder, after days of prayer and fasting, would declare the name the spirits had revealed for them. The names carried power, told stories, connected a person to their ancestors and to the natural world. A name like Walks with Thunder or Morning Star Woman wasn't just poetic, it was a roadmap for a life, a reminder of who you were meant to become. In the Navajo Nation, the practice of the Kinalda, the coming-of-age ceremony for young women, was becoming rarer with each passing year. Margaret So, who came of age in 1972, was one of the last in her extended family to have the full traditional ceremony. For 4 days, she had run toward the east each morning at dawn, her relatives running beside her, singing songs that connected her to changing woman. The holy being whose own journey into womanhood had established the pattern for all Navajo girls. She ground corn on a stone metat for hours, preparing the ceremonial cake that would be baked in an earth oven. Her hair was combed and tied in the traditional way, and every action, from the grinding to the running, to the molding of her body in the ceremonial position, was meant to shape her into a strong woman who embodied the beauty and balance of Navajo philosophy. "My daughters didn't have this," Margaret said quietly in 1985, a hint of sadness in her voice. "By the time they were old enough, we were living in Flagstaff. Their father had worked there. We were in an apartment. How do you build an earth oven on the 3rd floor? How do you run toward the sunrise when you're surrounded by buildings?" The practical obstacles were real, but beneath them was something deeper, a sense that the ceremony belonged to a different time, a different world. The girls went to public school, watched American television, listened to rock music. The 4-day ceremony felt, to them, like something from a museum. The art of traditional food preservation was disappearing just as quietly. Among the Tlingit people of southeast Alaska, the old ways of smoking salmon had been passed down through countless generations. In the 1970 seconds, you could still find smokehouses in some villages, but they were increasingly rare. Emma Peterson, a Tlingit elder, tried to teach her grandchildren the process in 1976, but they grew impatient with the days of careful preparation, the precise cutting of the fish, the tending of the alder wood fire that couldn't be too hot or too cold, the watching and waiting as the salmon slowly took on the deep red color and rich flavor that marked properly smoked fish. "They want to go to the store," Emma said, shaking her head with a mix of frustration and understanding. "They can buy salmon in a can. Why spend 3 days smoking fish when you can open a can in 3 seconds?" What they didn't understand, what perhaps couldn't be understood without doing it, was that the smoking process was never just about preserving food. It was about patience, about respecting the gift of the salmon who had given their lives, about connecting to the cycle of seasons and the wisdom of ancestors who had perfected this craft over thousands of years. When the smokehouses fell silent, something more than food preservation was lost. The winter storytelling tradition faced similar pressures. Among many tribes, winter was the sacred time for stories, the months when the earth rested, and the people gathered in warm homes to hear the tales that carried their history, values, and spiritual teachings. Leonard Crow Dog, a Lakota medicine man, noticed the change beginning in the late 960 seconds, and accelerating through the 70s. The young people didn't want to sit for hours listening to the old stories, he observed. They had homework, they had basketball practice, they wanted to watch television shows. The stories themselves were dying with the storytellers. These weren't simple tales to entertain children, they were complex narratives that explained the origin of ceremonies, the nature of sacred beings, the proper way to conduct oneself in the world. Many could only be told in winter, and some could only be told by certain people who had earned the right through years of learning and spiritual preparation. When a storyteller died without having passed on the complete versions of these narratives, entire branches of cultural knowledge disappeared with them. In the Pueblo communities of New Mexico, the intricate system of traditional weather observation was fading from practice. For centuries, Pueblo people had maintained a sophisticated understanding of climate patterns, tracking the movements of stars, the behavior of animals, the subtle shifts in wind and cloud that signaled coming weather changes. This knowledge informed when to plant, when to perform rain ceremonies, when to prepare for drought or winter storms. By the 970 seconds, younger farmers were relying on radio weather reports and almanacs purchased from the store. The old weather signs, the way the ants built their hills, the timing of the swallow's return, the particular quality of the sunset went unread, and with them went a deep literacy in the language of the natural world. Joseph Abeita, a farmer from Isleta Pueblo, tried to explain the loss to a researcher in 1977. My grandfather could tell you what the winter would be like by watching the wasps in August. He knew which years would bring good rain by things I never learned to see. He tried to teach me, but I was young, and I thought the radio weatherman knew more than an old man watching bugs. By the time Joseph realized the depth of his grandfather's knowledge, the old man was gone, and much of what he knew had gone with him. The practice of traditional medicine gathering was becoming rare for similar reasons. Mary Louise Defender Wilson, a Dakota and Hidatsa elder, spoke about this loss with particular poignancy. When I was a girl, my grandmother took me out to gather medicines. She knew every plant, every root, every bark that could heal. She knew what time of year to gather each one, what prayers to say, how to prepare them. She knew which plants worked together and which ones didn't. This wasn't just knowing some herbs, it was a whole science, a whole spiritual practice. By the 970 seconds, most Native people were getting their medicine from the Indian Health Service clinics or from drugstores in town. The knowledge of plant medicine was held by an ever-shrinking number of elders, and younger people rarely showed interest in the years of patient learning required to master this healing art. When Mary Louise tried to teach her own daughters in the early 70s, they were polite but disengaged. They were grateful, but I could see in their eyes they thought it was old-fashioned, maybe even primitive. They trusted the doctor and his pills more than they trusted the medicines that had kept our people healthy for thousands of years. The star knowledge traditions were suffering perhaps the most dramatic decline. Many tribes had sophisticated astronomical systems that guided ceremonial timing, agricultural practices, and spiritual observances. The Pawnee, for instance, had one of the most complex stellar cosmologies on the continent, with detailed knowledge of planetary movements and star positions that rivaled European astronomical systems of earlier centuries. By the 970 seconds, this knowledge was held by only a handful of elders, and artificial lighting was making it harder for anyone to see the stars clearly enough to learn the old patterns. We used to lie on our backs on summer nights and my uncle would point out the star patterns and tell me their names and stories, remembered Vincent White Thunder, a Pawnee man interviewed in 1979. Each star pattern had ceremonies connected to it, times when certain bundles were opened, certain songs sung. Now the mercury vapor lights are so bright in town, you can barely see the stars. And even if you could, who has the time? Who has someone to teach them? That knowledge is walking into the darkness with the old people. The tradition of dream interpretation and vision seeking was facing unique challenges. In many tribal traditions, dreams were taken seriously as sources of guidance, warnings, and spiritual power. Young people were taught to remember and understand their dreams, and certain powerful dreams might lead to vision quests, sacred periods of fasting and prayer in isolated places where spiritual insight and personal purpose could be revealed. By the 70s, many Native young people were being raised in homes where such ideas were downplayed or dismissed. The boarding school experience of previous generations had taught many Native parents that traditional spiritual practices were something to be hidden or abandoned. Robert Running Bear, a Lakota man who worked with young people in the 1,970 seconds, saw this loss firsthand. The kids would have powerful dreams, dreams that in the old days would have been recognized as sacred, as calling them to certain paths. But they'd been taught to ignore them, or worse, to be embarrassed by them. They wanted to be modern, to fit in with the white kids at school. Talking about dreams and visions marked you as different, as too Indian. So they learned to keep quiet, and the dreams went unexamined, and the guidance they offered went unheeded. The ceremonial bundle traditions were dying out in many communities for the simple reason that maintaining these sacred objects required knowledge, dedication, and resources that were increasingly hard to muster. Ceremonial bundles, collections of sacred objects wrapped in leather or cloth, were at the heart of many tribal spiritual systems. Each bundle had specific songs, prayers, and ceremonies associated with it. They had to be opened and honored at particular times of year, and this required not just knowledge but community participation. A bundle isn't like a book you can put on a shelf and forget about, explained Harold Gray, a Blackfeet elder, in 1976. It's alive, in a sense. It requires care, attention, ceremony. When I was young, the whole community understood this. People would come together for the bundle openings. They knew the songs. But now, people are scattered. They work jobs in town. They can't take off work for a 4-day ceremony. And if you can't maintain a bundle properly, you're supposed to pass it on to someone who can. But who? Who has the knowledge? Who has the time? So the bundles are being put away, or given to museums. And when that happens, we lose something irreplaceable. The traditional marriage customs were being replaced by modern wedding ceremonies, and with them went complex systems of kinship obligations and relationship teachings. In traditional Lakota culture, for instance, marriage wasn't just about two individuals, it was about joining families in ways that created specific obligations and relationships between all the relatives involved. There were particular ways a man should behave toward his mother-in-law, specific responsibilities between brothers-in-law, intricate protocols that governed family interactions. Today, people just get married at the church or the courthouse, observed Grace Spotted Eagle, a Lakota grandmother, in 1978. They don't know about the old ways of joining families. They don't understand the relationships. A son-in-law doesn't know how to show proper respect to his wife's family. A daughter-in-law doesn't know her place in the family structure. This sounds old-fashioned to young people, I know. They think it's just about freedom and love. But what we had was a system that made families strong, that prevented conflicts, that created networks of mutual support. Without it, families fall apart more easily. The practice of traditional child rearing, particularly the role of extended family in raising children, was being eroded by modern housing patterns and economic pressures. In traditional Native societies, children were raised by the whole community. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins All played active roles in teaching and caring for children. This wasn't just practical, it was how cultural knowledge was transmitted, how children learned their place in the family and community, how they developed relationships with multiple generations. When I was growing up in the 40s and 50s, I spent as much time with my grandparents as with my parents, remembered Stella Fasthorse, a Crow woman interviewed in 1980. My grandmother taught me beadwork and stories. My grandfather taught me about horses and respect. Every adult in the community had some responsibility for every child. But by the time I was raising my own children in the 70s, we were living in base housing at the Army post. My husband was stationed far from home. My children barely knew their grandparents. I was trying to raise them alone, the way white people do, and so much was lost. They never learned the language. They never learned the old ways of behaving. They were Native American by blood, but in many ways, they were being raised as white children. The communal work practices were fading as well. Traditionally, many tasks building homes, harvesting crops, hunting, processing game were done communally. These work parties weren't just about efficiency. They were social and cultural events where stories were shared, skills were taught, and community bonds were strengthened. By the 1,970 people worked individual jobs, often off the reservation. They came home tired and retreated into their individual family units. The old pattern of gathering to work together, with all its cultural richness, was becoming rare. "I remember the corn harvests when I was young," said Bernard Samuels, a Mohawk man from Akwesasne, speaking in 1977. "Everyone would come together. We'd work in the fields during the day, and the women would cook huge meals. The old men would tell stories while we worked. The young people would flirt and joke. It was hard work, yes, but it was also joyful. We were together. We were doing what our people had always done. Now, people work alone. They buy their corn from the supermarket. We've gained convenience, but we've lost something precious, that sense of working together, of being part of something larger than ourselves." The seasonal round of movements and activities that had structured native life for generations was being abandoned as people settled into permanent year-round housing. Historically, many tribes moved through the landscape with the seasons, maintaining summer and winter camps, traveling to hunting grounds, fishing sites, and gathering areas at appropriate times. This movement wasn't random wandering, it was a sophisticated system of resource management and cultural practice. Each location had ceremonies and activities associated with it. By the 1,970 economic and political pressures had forced most native people into permanent settlements. Children were required to attend school year-round, which made seasonal movement impossible. Jobs tied people to specific locations. Government housing programs built permanent houses and expected people to stay in them. The deep knowledge of the landscape that came from moving through it seasonally, understanding each place's gifts and requirements, was no longer being passed on. "My great-grandfather knew every inch of our traditional territory," said William Medicine Crow, a Northern Cheyenne elder interviewed in 1979. "He knew where the best roots grew, where the elk would be in each season, where the sacred plants could be found, where the spirits were strong. He knew because he traveled that land all his life, as his ancestors had. But I've lived in the same house since 1952. I work at the lumber mill. My grandchildren have never spent a night away from the reservation town. How can they know the land? How can they have that intimate relationship with place that our people once had?" The oral history tradition was being undermined by the introduction of written history and formal education. Native people had always preserved their history through oral tradition, detailed, carefully memorized accounts passed from generation to generation. These oral histories weren't vague myths. They were precise accounts that could stretch back centuries, maintained through rigorous memorization and regular recitation. But in the 1,970 Native children were learning history from textbooks written by non-Native historians. These books rarely included Native perspectives and often contradicted the oral histories preserved by Native communities. Young people began to trust the written word more than the spoken word, the textbook more than the grandmother. The old historians, the keepers of oral tradition, found fewer and fewer young people willing to undertake the years of training required to memorize and preserve these histories. In the old days, certain people were trained from childhood to remember everything, explained Albert Whitehat Sr., a Lakota historian and language teacher, in a 1981 interview. They would memorize entire histories, every detail, every name, every event. They were living libraries. But now we have tape recorders and video cameras. People think, we'll just record the old people talking, and then we'll have it forever. But it's not the same. The act of memorization, of carrying the history in your body and mind, of being responsible for preserving it, that created a different relationship with the knowledge. When we stopped memorizing, we stopped really knowing our history in the deep way our ancestors did. The traditional education system, the way children were taught to learn through observation, participation, and patient practice, was being replaced by Western-style formal schooling. In traditional Native education, children learned by watching adults and gradually participating in adult activities. A child learned to hunt by following hunters and slowly taking on more responsibility. A child learned to make pottery by watching a grandmother and helping with simple tasks before attempting complex work. There was no formal instruction in the Western sense, no lectures or textbooks, but the learning was profound and lasting. The Indian Education Act of 1972 and other federal initiatives of that era were bringing more resources to Native schools, but they were structured according to Western educational models. Children sat at desks, read from books, learned from teachers standing at blackboards. This wasn't how Native people had traditionally educated their young, and much was lost in the translation. Our traditional way of teaching was through doing, said Beatrice Medicine, a Dakota anthropologist and educator, reflecting on this shift. A child learned patience, observation, respect, and specific skills all at the same time. But in school, they're learning facts and taking tests. They're learning to sit still and be quiet, which is the opposite of traditional learning that involved active participation. They're learning to compete for grades instead of learning to contribute to community. The content might include some Native history now, but the entire process of how learning happens has been colonized. The sacred clown traditions, which existed in various forms across many tribes, were dying out almost completely. Sacred clowns served important functions in tribal ceremonies, using humor and transgressive behavior to teach lessons, provide social commentary, and maintain spiritual balance. Among the Pueblo peoples, the kosher clowns performed at ceremonies. Among Plains tribes, the Hayoka performed similar functions. These weren't simple entertainers, they were spiritually ordained individuals who underwent rigorous training and carried significant responsibilities. By the 1972, few young people were taking on these roles. The training was demanding, the spiritual requirements were intense, and the social function of the clowns was less understood in modern tribal communities. Moreover, non-Native observers had often misunderstood and mocked these traditions, leading some Native communities to perform these ceremonies more privately or not at all. The clowns taught us through laughter, but they also taught us humility, explained a Pueblo elder who asked not to be named, speaking in 1978. They reminded us not to take ourselves too seriously. They could say things in ceremony that no one else could say. They kept us balanced. But young people don't understand this anymore. They see the clowns and they're embarrassed. They think it's undignified. So the tradition is dying, and with it, we're losing an important way of learning and an important spiritual function. The traditional games and athletic competitions that had once been central to tribal social life were being replaced by Western sports. Games like lacrosse, originally a Native American game with deep spiritual significance, had been adopted and transformed by white culture into something entirely different. Other traditional games, like the Inuit blanket toss, the hand game common across many tribes, and various forms of traditional ball games were played rarely or only as demonstrations for tourists. These games had been more than entertainment. They taught skills, built community, had ceremonial significance, and provided ways for young people to demonstrate courage, skill, and character. When they were replaced by basketball, football, and baseball games, invented by and structured according to white American culture, something important was lost. "We used to play the hand game for hours, sometimes all night," remembered Russell Means, the Oglala Lakota activist, speaking about his youth in the 1,940 seconds and 50 seconds. It wasn't gambling in the white sense. It was a contest of will, intuition, and spiritual power. It brought the community together. It taught young people patience and focus. But by the time I was grown, the hand game was something old people played occasionally. The young people wanted to play basketball. Basketball is a good game, but it doesn't carry our culture the way our own games did. The traditional conflict resolution practices were being forgotten as tribal communities came under the jurisdiction of state and federal court systems. Historically, tribes had sophisticated methods for resolving disputes that focused on healing, restoration, and maintaining community harmony rather than punishment. When someone caused harm, the community worked to understand why, to heal the injury, to restore balance. The offender remained part of the community, and the resolution process involved extended family and community members, not external authorities. By the 1,970 seconds, most serious crimes on reservations were handled by federal courts, and many tribes had adopted Western-style tribal courts for other matters. These systems focused on determining guilt and assigning punishment. They removed the responsibility for justice from the community and placed it in the hands of judges and lawyers, who often had little understanding of traditional Native values. When there was a wrong in the old days, the whole community was involved in making it right, explained Stella Leach, a Cheyenne elder and tribal court advocate, in 1980. "We didn't put people in cages. We worked to heal the hurt, to restore the person who had done wrong, to rebalance things. It wasn't always easy, but it kept the community strong. Now we have a jail on the reservation. We have lawyers and judges doing things the white way. It's not our way, but the young people don't know any other way. They think this is how justice has always been done." These 20 traditions, naming ceremonies, coming-of-age rituals, food preservation arts, winter storytelling, weather observation, traditional medicine gathering, star knowledge, dream interpretation, bundle keeping, marriage customs, communal child rearing, work parties, seasonal movements, oral history preservation, traditional learning methods, sacred clown traditions, native games, and traditional justice were just the most visible losses. Behind each one were dozens of smaller practices, pieces of knowledge, ways of being that were disappearing just as quickly. What made this loss particularly painful was its quietness. There were no dramatic final moments, no last ceremonies marked by the whole community. Instead, these traditions simply faded, practiced by fewer and fewer people, remembered by an ever-shrinking number of elders, until one day they were simply gone. A grandmother passed away, taking with her the songs she'd never found time to teach. A grandfather's stories were forgotten because the grandchildren had been too busy to listen. A sacred bundle was donated to a museum because no one remained who knew how to care for it. Some Native people saw what was happening and tried desperately to reverse it. The American Indian movement and other activist groups of the 1,970 seconds weren't just fighting for political rights, they were fighting for cultural survival. Language programs were started. Cultural centers were established. Elders were recorded on audio tape and later video. These efforts saved some knowledge, preserved some traditions, and helped spark a cultural revival that would grow stronger in subsequent decades. But much was still lost. Languages that had been spoken for thousands of years fell silent. Ceremonies that had maintained spiritual balance for countless generations were performed for the last time. Knowledge systems that had sustained native peoples through ice ages and epidemics, through invasion and forced relocation, finally succumbed not to active suppression, but to the quiet erosion of modernity, poverty, and cultural disconnection. Standing in her living room in 1979, 5 years after we first saw her teaching her grandchildren, Grandmother Nellie lit another braid of sweetgrass. Her grandchildren were older now, and some of them had moved away, but a few remained, and on this day they had brought their own children to learn. The circle was smaller than it had been in previous generations, and some of what Nellie had learned from her own grandmother had already been forgotten. But she lit the sweetgrass anyway, spoke the prayers she remembered, and told the stories she still carried. She couldn't pass on everything, too much had already been lost, but she could pass on something. And in those homes where grandmothers still lit the sweetgrass, where stories were still told in native languages, where even a few of the old ways were practiced and honored, the thread remained unbroken, thinner than it had been, worn by the passage through difficult years, but unbroken still. And as long as that thread held, there remained hope that what had been diminished might someday be strengthened, that what had been nearly lost might yet be remembered and revived.